Most men find out their marriage has been a lie when they find a text message they weren't supposed to see, or maybe a receipt or a phone number saved under a fake name. I found out when a plumber I'd hired to fix a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink knocked on my back door, took off his cap, and said, "Sir, I need you to come look at something in your crawl space. And I think you need to call the police before you do." My name is Raymond Colt. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, coached the debate team for 22 of those years, and I retired 2 summers ago with a cake shaped like a textbook and a handshake from the principal. I live in a 4-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Terrace that my wife and I bought when our youngest was still in diapers. I grow tomatoes in the side yard every spring. I drink my coffee black. I go to bed at 10 and wake up at 5:30 because my body forgot I'm retired. Until 14 days ago, I considered myself a man who had earned a quiet life. Before we go any further, do me one small favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Drop a comment when you're done listening. I read every one of them. Now let me tell you about my wife. Her name is Sandra Elaine Colt. Married 22 years, together for 25. She likes gardening shows, long baths, and she reads historical fiction the way some people eat chips. One chapter is never enough. She volunteers at the church rummage sale every October without fail. She remembers every birthday in the extended family, sends actual cards with actual stamps, and she takes her tea with 2 sugars and a squeeze of lemon over ice in the summer. I know this woman. I know her the way you know a road you've driven 10,000 times. You stop seeing it. That is exactly what she counted on. This all started on a Monday in March, which is still cold enough in Louisiana to make you feel cheated. Sandra was up in Shreveport visiting her sister Pauline. She'd been gone 2 days. I was doing what I always do when she's away, eating whatever I want for dinner, watching documentaries she has no interest in, going to bed without negotiating the thermostat. Then I noticed the puddle under the kitchen sink. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow, dark stain spreading across the cabinet floor, warping the particle board. I pulled everything out from under there, the dish soap, the extra sponges, the WD-40 I hadn't touched in a decade, and saw the pipe joint weeping steadily. Not an emergency, but the kind of thing that becomes one if you ignore it. I called Blevins Plumbing, which has a sign on Airline Highway I've driven past 100 times. Guy named Terrence Blevins showed up the next morning. Stocky, quiet, methodical. Brought his own floor mat to kneel on. I liked him immediately. "Give me about 45 minutes, he said, sliding under the sink. "Might need to run a line check through the crawl space to see if this is isolated or systemic." I told him to take his time and went to the back porch with my coffee and a history podcast. I was halfway through an episode about the Battle of Midway when Terrence appeared in the doorway, looking like a man choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Colt, I need you to come see something." He took me around to the crawl space access panel on the north side of the house, the one behind the azaleas that Sandra had always said were her azaleas, and asked me not to trim without checking with her first. The panel was open. Terrence had his flashlight aimed into the dark. "I got about 6 feet in when I found it," he said. "There's a secondary structure back there. Somebody built a room." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Terrence, this house was built in 1987. There's no room under there." He looked at me without smiling. "Sir, I've been doing this 21 years. That's a room, and there's a hasp latch on this side of the door, padlocked. You lock a door from the outside. Whatever's inside isn't supposed to get out on its own." I stopped laughing. I got down on my knees and looked in with the flashlight. He was right. About 12 feet into the crawl space, past the old ductwork and the vapor barrier, someone had framed out walls with 2x4s, hung a plywood door, flush enough with the darkness that you'd never find it unless you were down there with a light looking for pipe runs, and on the door, one heavy padlock through a hasp. From the outside, "Call the police," I said. "Already have my hand on my phone," Terrence said. 2 deputies and a detective arrived within 20 minutes. I stood in my own side yard in my retirement slippers, feeling like a man who had walked into the wrong house. They used bolt cutters. The door swung inward. The room was roughly 8 by 10. Poured concrete floor, rough framed walls, a battery-powered lantern on a shelf, not lit, and on a folding table in the center, a prepaid laptop, closed, a manila envelope, and a digital recorder, the kind reporters used to carry, sitting upright like it was waiting to be picked up. The detective, a woman named Angela Doss, calm voice, sharp eyes, the kind of person who takes notes with real pen on real paper, opened the envelope with gloved hands. Inside was a deed of transfer document and a printout of a bank wire confirmation. The deed appeared to transfer partial ownership of our house to an LLC I had never heard of. The wire confirmation showed $42,000 moved from a joint savings account to a business account registered in my name. The account number meant nothing to me. The LLC name meant nothing to me. My signature at the bottom of the deed meant everything because it was perfect, not close, perfect. Detective Doss looked at me with the professional neutrality of someone who has looked at a lot of people in a lot of difficult moments. Mr. Colt, are you familiar with an LLC called Colt Property Holdings? I've never heard of it in my life, I said. And that was absolutely true. But here's the part I didn't say out loud. The part I had to sit with alone, before I could say it to anyone. When I went back inside after the deputies left with their evidence bags and their photographs, I walked to the guest room closet where Sandra stores her off-season clothes in clear bins. Behind the bins, on the floor, wrapped in an old beach towel, I found a fireproof lockbox. I had seen this box before. She'd said it held her mother's jewelry. I had never asked to open it. Why would I? The key was on her key ring. The copy I keep for emergencies in the kitchen junk drawer. Inside the box, a notarized power of attorney document bearing my signature, granting Sandra sole authority over all shared assets in the event of Raymond Colt's legal incapacitation or criminal detention. And a sticky note, handwritten, with a PIN number and a P.O. box address in a town called Destrehan, 12 miles west of us. I sat on the guest room floor for a long time. If you've been with us for a while and want to keep hearing stories like this, please hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you, genuinely. Now, here's what nobody tells you about being set up by your own wife. The hardest part isn't finding the evidence. It's the moment you realize she built the lock before she told you where the door was. It had been 5 days since Terrence Blevins led me around those azaleas. 5 days since Detective Doss started calling. Not every day, but enough that her number was starting to feel familiar in the way that numbers you're dreading become familiar. Sandra had come home from Shreveport the morning after the crawl space was discovered. I hadn't told her everything on the phone, just that something had happened with the plumbing and she needed to come home. When she walked through the door, she looked exactly the way a worried wife looks. Arms around my neck, hands cold from the drive, voice soft with concern. Raymond, what happened? Are you okay? You scared me. I held on to her and said I was fine. For about an hour, I believed the hug. She cried when I showed her the crawl space access panel. Genuine-looking tears. And at 63, I've seen enough of both kinds that I don't always trust my ability to tell the difference anymore. She held my arm and said the right things. Who would do this to us? This is terrifying. Should we call our attorney? That last part. She offered a lawyer before I'd even thought to ask for one. At the time, I thought she was being protective. I understand now. She was being prepared. When Detective Doss came to the house 2 days later and showed us the LLC paperwork and the wire transfer documentation, I watched Sandra's face the way I used to watch students during exams. You can always tell, in the first half second, whether they knew the answer before they walked in the door. Sandra's face did something, very briefly, that I can only describe as a quiet calibration, like a scale settling. Then the tears came back, and she reached across the kitchen table for my hand. Someone is trying to destroy my husband, she said firmly. This is a deliberate setup. Raymond has never had anything to do with any LLC. Detective Doss let that sit for a moment. Mrs. Colt, how long has that panel behind the azaleas been sealed with landscape staples? Sandra didn't miss a beat. I don't go back there. I just keep the bushes up. I replayed that exchange 300 times over the next week. She didn't say she didn't know about the panel. She redirected. A lawyer's reflex dressed in a wife's voice. Here's where I have to tell you about my son-in-law, Marcus Webb. He's married to my daughter Diane, and he works in forensic accounting for a firm in New Orleans. Marcus is the kind of man who communicates primarily through raised eyebrows and spreadsheets, and I mean that as a sincere compliment. I called him on day 6, drove to their house in Metairie, and sat at his kitchen table and told him everything, while Diane kept refilling my coffee and trying to keep her expression from falling apart. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Raymond, who managed the household finances?" I opened my mouth, closed it. Sandra had managed them. Since year 3 of the marriage, when I'd been in the middle of curriculum redesign and mentioned that the bill paying was getting away from me and she'd offered to take it over, I had said, "Thank you." I had not thought about it since. Why would I? Every bill was paid. The savings had grown steadily. When I asked about money, she gave me clean, confident answers. I had been a history teacher for 31 years, and I had not once paused to examine the history of my own bank account. "Pull every statement," Marcus said. "Every account. Go back at least 6 years." I pulled 8. What he found did not announce itself. That was what made it so precise. There were no dramatic transfers, no sudden zeroed-out balances. Instead, there was a pattern, patient, meticulous, nearly invisible, recurring charges to vendor names that sounded like utilities but weren't. Transfers every other month to an account I didn't recognize, always between $400 and $900, never rounded to a number that would feel alarming. A cash advance here, a wire there, always calibrated to stay beneath the attention threshold of a man who trusted his wife to handle the numbers. Over 6 years, it totaled just over $73,000. $73,000, moved so quietly across 6 years that I had heard absolutely nothing. Marcus spread the statements across his kitchen table and pointed at the earliest irregular transaction. It was dated 8 months before Sandra had first suggested we take out a home equity line of credit, a suggestion I'd agreed to because she said we'd need it for the roof eventually. And she was right. We did need it for the roof. But the line of credit had also given her access to a new instrument, a new channel. One more layer between the money and the question of where it was going. "This isn't reactive," Marcus said quietly, which is his way of preparing you for something worse than you've already heard. She didn't start doing this after something went wrong between you two. Look at the date on that first transaction. I looked. The month, the year, I sat with it. "That was 4 months after my mother's funeral," I said. "When you inherited," Marcus said. I had inherited $60,000 from my mother's estate and deposited every cent into our joint account because we were partners, because that's what you do, because I had been married 17 years at that point, and it had never once occurred to me that the word joint might be load-bearing in a way I hadn't understood. She had started this with my mother's money, and I had watered her garden every single day while she built the frame of my cage. "The LLC," Marcus said. "Walk me through the business accounts you've opened in the last 10 years. "I have opened 0 business accounts. I am a retired school teacher. I had a checking account, a savings account, a retirement fund, and a Costco credit card. That is the complete financial portfolio of Raymond Colt." Marcus turned his laptop toward me. Colt Property Holdings, LLC had been registered in Louisiana 14 months ago. The registered agent was a mail forwarding service in Metairie. The business address was a UPS store on Veterans Boulevard. And the articles of organization listed Raymond Arthur Colt as sole member, signed perfectly, flawlessly, in my hand. She had my signature, the way a counterfeiter has a plate. She had been watching it for 22 years. I stood up from Marcus's table and walked to the window and looked out at the street. A normal Tuesday, cars going by, a kid on a bicycle, a woman pushing a stroller, all of it unchanged and entirely wrong, the way the world always looks right after the ground shifts under you. "There's something else," Marcus said. "The power of attorney you found in the lockbox. If you had been arrested and held even briefly, even without charges, that document would have given her legal authority to act on every shared asset while you were detained. She didn't need a conviction. She needed a weekend. A weekend. That was all the original plan required. A plumber finds a secret room. Evidence in my name is inside it. I'm detained for 48, maybe 72 hours. She exercises the power of attorney, moves what's left, and by the time I'm released and the confusion is sorted out, she's already somewhere warm with $73,000 and clean hands. I drove home that night, and sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside. And then I made a decision. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over a man when fear finishes its work and something colder and cleaner takes its place. I found that stillness on a Wednesday evening parked in my own driveway, and I carried it inside, and I set it on the kitchen table like a tool I was going to need. I did not call Detective Doss. Not yet. I did not confront Sandra. I did not say a single word that suggested I had spent 24 hours at Marcus's kitchen table turning her architecture inside out. Because here is the truth about evidence. It only works when the person presenting it is believed. And right now, in the eyes of the Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office, I was a 63-year-old man with a secret room under his house and his name on a fraudulent LLC. My credibility needed rebuilding before I could use it as a weapon. Sandra had counted on that too. So, I did the one thing she had not accounted for. I became a man she couldn't read. The first call I made was to my oldest friend, a man named Gerald Fontenot. Gerald spent 28 years as an investigator for the Louisiana Department of Insurance before he retired to fish and annoy his grandchildren. He is patient, relentless, and he has a memory for detail that still slightly frightens me after 40 years of friendship. I drove to his house in Prairieville on a Thursday, told Sandra I needed to clear my head with some fishing, and watched her arrange her face into an expression of warm, understanding concern. "Take all the time you need, Raymond," she said. I almost told her right then. I didn't. At Gerald's kitchen table, over his terrible chicory coffee and a bag of cracklins, I laid out the whole map. The room, the LLC, the power of attorney, the bank records, the $73,000, Marcus's forensic breakdown of 6 years of financial misdirection. Gerald listened the way he always listened, completely still, elbows on the table, eyes on mine. When I finished, he said, "She talks to someone." It wasn't a question. "Her friend Beverly," I said. "Beverly Arsenault. They've been close since before I came along. She lives in Lafayette. Comes down maybe 3 or 4 times a year. They talk on the phone for hours. Sandra takes those calls in the sunroom at the back of the house, door closed, sometimes 2 in the afternoon, sometimes 10 at night." Gerald nodded once, the way he nods when he's already decided something. "You have a baby monitor?" "Gerald, I know you don't," he said, "but you're going to get one. I want to be clear about who I am, because it matters here. I taught 17-year-olds about the Constitution for 3 decades. I coached kids to argue both sides of every issue with fairness and evidence. I believe in due process the way some people believe in gravity, not as an opinion, but as a fact the world is organized around. Surveillance is not in my nature. Recorded conversations are not in my nature. But I am also a man who watched his mother's inheritance disappear into a 6-year financial maze built in the walls of a life he thought he understood. And I have learned, at 63, that patience is the only thing that never runs out of ammunition. Gerald ordered the monitor that afternoon, paid with a prepaid card he bought at a gas station, shipped it to his own address. It arrived in 3 days. On a Sunday afternoon, while Sandra was at the garden center, she said she needed mulch. I installed it behind the large ceramic planter in the far corner of the sunroom that has not been moved in, I would estimate. 11 years. Took me 6 minutes. I tested the audio feed on Gerald's laptop at his house that evening. Clear as a bell. I drove home and had dinner with my wife. She made red beans and rice, the real kind, cooked all day, the kind that takes patience and practice. It was extraordinary, as always. I told her so. She smiled and asked how Gerald was doing and whether the crappie were biting yet. I said the fish were slow, but Gerald was the same as always. She laughed and topped off my iced tea. I waited 23 days. 23 days of being Raymond Colt, cooperative homeowner, patient subject of an ongoing financial investigation, devoted husband. 23 days of answering Detective Doss's questions thoughtfully and watching Sandra hold my hand across the table during those conversations and saying all the right things about how she knew I would never do any of this. She knew me. She knew my character. She knew my handwriting. She never knew what I was thinking. Beverly Arsenault came down from Lafayette on a Saturday in the 4th week. I told Sandra I was going to Marcus and Diane's for the afternoon, which was true. I went there. I played with my grandchildren. I had a normal afternoon, and at 3:47 I excused myself to the backyard and opened my phone. Gerald had forwarded the audio feed to an app on my phone. I sat in my daughter's backyard in a lawn chair and listened. The first 20 minutes were ordinary. Beverly's youngest had gotten engaged. A restaurant in Lafayette was worth the drive. Sandra's tomatoes were coming in early this year, which she was pleased about. I sat and listened and thought about the possibility that I had simply lost my mind, that grief and suspicion had combined into something that wasn't real, that I had planted a listening device in my home, based on bank statements and a forensic accountant's instincts and the word of a fishing retiree. Then Sandra's voice changed. I have no better way to describe it than that. It was the same voice, the same warmth, same cadence, and then it wasn't. Like a lamp with a dimmer being turned, just slightly, toward something lower and cooler. He has no idea, Sandra said. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then, you're sure? He's been acting completely normal? He's Raymond, Sandra said, and the familiarity in her voice, the almost affectionate exasperation of it, made something tighten in my chest. He's grading papers that don't exist anymore. He's watering the garden. He's being patient with the detective. He's explaining to Diane that I wouldn't do this. He's building my defense for me, and he doesn't even know it. And the room? Beverly asked. The LLC? The room was just the stage, Sandra said. The LLC is the story the police already believe. All I need is for Raymond to stay exactly who he is. Decent, cooperative, credible, while everything keeps building around him. By the time it resolves, the equity line is accessible, the power of attorney is active, and I'm already where I said I'd be. A pause. Beverly's voice was careful when she spoke again. Sandra, where exactly is that? My cousin has a place in Costa Rica, Sandra said. 2 bedrooms, off the water. It's been arranged for months. I was going to be gone before the 60-day window on the LLC account closed. And Raymond? Raymond is a patient man, Sandra said. He'll figure it out eventually. He always figures everything out eventually. He just always figures it out one season too late. She said it without malice. That was the part that settled into my chest and stayed there. Not with anger, not with contempt, with something almost like fondness, as if she had genuinely studied me and arrived at a conclusion about my nature, and the conclusion was that I was decent and slow and would get there eventually, long after she was already somewhere green and warm and gone. I sat in my daughter's lawn chair in the April afternoon and listened to my wife describe the architecture of my obsolescence, and I felt that cold, clean stillness settle through me like water finding its level. I did not call Gerald. I did not call Marcus. I did not call Detective Doss. Not yet. I went inside and played one more round of Uno with my grandchildren, and I lost on purpose because they're 7 and 4, and losing on purpose is one of the purest forms of love available to a grandfather. I need to tell you about Beverly Arsenault, because she matters in a way she may not have understood when she agreed to whatever she agreed to. 3 days after the Lafayette visit, I hired a private investigator named Carol Dupree. Carol is 61 years old, former sheriff's office, currently located in a small office above a po' boy shop on Government Street, and his entire professional personality is that of a man who has heard everything and is surprised by nothing. Gerald recommended him. I told Carol everything. Carol told me it would take time. It took him 9 days. What he found was this. Beverly Arsenault had not simply listened to Sandra's plan over the years. She had been an active participant in the early stages. She had served as the registered agent for Colt Property Holdings LLC through a shell address, a small tax preparation business she co-owned in Lafayette. She had received 2 wire transfers, totaling $11,000 over the previous 14 months, from an account registered to a business entity called Bayou Stone Consulting that traced back, circuitously but clearly, to the account Sandra had been building for 6 years. Beverly was not an innocent bystander who heard too much. She was a load-bearing wall in the structure. Carol also found, through a contact in Costa Rican property records, a rental agreement for a 2-bedroom property outside of Nosara, signed in the name Sandra E. Colt. Occupancy date, 6 weeks from now. I sat with that for a full day. 6 weeks. She had given herself a 6-week margin. I had 23 days of recordings, Marcus's forensic breakdown of 6 years of accounts, Carol's documented evidence on Beverly's participation, the LLC registration paperwork, and a rental agreement, with Sandra's name, and a start date. Two things she did not know existed. Here is what I did not do. I did not walk into the sheriff's office alone and hand it all over, because a man walking in alone with a box of evidence against his own wife, while he is still technically a person of financial interest, does not get listened to the way a man should. Sandra had thought about that too. She had built the credibility problem into the architecture from the beginning. So, on a Thursday evening, while Sandra was in the sunroom reading, she had moved on from historical fiction to a legal thriller. The audacity of this woman. I sent one file and one photograph to a number Sandra did not recognize, and an email address she had never seen. The audio file was 28 seconds long. It was the portion of the recording where Sandra said, in her own voice, warm and specific, and completely clear. By the time it resolves, the equity line is accessible, the power of attorney is active, and I'm already where I said I'd be. The photograph was Carol's documentation of the Nosara rental agreement with Sandra's signature. No message, no name, no context. I washed my coffee mug, read a chapter of a book I'd been ignoring for a month, and went to bed at 10 o'clock, as I have done nearly every night of my retired life. She came downstairs at 11:47. I know because I was not asleep. I heard her footsteps stop outside the bedroom door. She stood there for a long time, long enough that I counted 61 seconds before she moved again. In 22 years, Sandra Elaine Colt had never once stood still in a doorway. She was always in motion, always arranging, managing, calibrating. She stood in that doorway, like a woman who had put her hand on a surface she had expected to be solid and found empty air instead. Good. The next morning I drove to Detective Doss's office. I was there when she arrived at 8:15. I set Carol's complete report on her desk, the recorded conversation, the LLC documentation, the Nosara rental agreement, Beverly Arsenault's financial participation, 6 years of annotated bank statements, and Marcus's forensic accounting summary. All of it organized in a brown accordion folder with a label that said, in my retired school teacher's handwriting, Colt Complete. Detective Doss read for 14 minutes without speaking. I sat across from her and drank the coffee she'd offered and waited. Patience, as I said, is the only currency that never runs out. Mr. Colt, she finally said. Angela, I said. It was the first time I'd used her first name, and she noticed. I think we both know you didn't register that LLC. She picked up her phone. Sandra was arrested on a Wednesday morning. 11 charges including fraud, forgery, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. Beverly Arsenault was arrested in Lafayette the same afternoon, 4 charges. The detective who drove out to Sandra called me from the driveway at 9:48 a.m., just to say it was done. I was in the side yard turning the soil around the tomato beds when my phone rang. The beds Sandra had designed. The soil I'd been turning every spring for 14 years, same as always, without ever being asked to explain why I kept showing up. She called me from the back of the patrol car. They allowed her one call, and she used it on me. I'm still not sure what she expected me to say. She didn't say much. Her voice was controlled and flat in the way that Sandra's voice got when she was deciding what information to give and what to withhold. Raymond, she said. Sandra, I said. A pause. Then, when did you know? I thought about it honestly, the way I always try to be honest about the things I'm less proud of. The morning after they opened the crawl space, I said. When I found the lockbox. I just needed time to understand the shape of it before I could do anything useful with what I knew. She was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, she said, I didn't think you'd move that fast. And there it was. The miscalculation at the center of the perfect plan. She had spent years watching what I did, how I filed papers, how I signed my name, how I slept, how I moved through the house, how I trusted without checking. She had studied my habits the way a scholar studies a text. She knew every visible surface of Raymond Arthur Colt. She had never once wondered what was underneath. At 63 years old, I have learned that the most dangerous thing about a quiet man is that everyone in the room is always surprised when he speaks. She spent years learning my signature. She never learned that the hand that writes the signature decides when to stop. I went back to my tomatoes. They needed turning. The weather was right. The work was patient and familiar and honest, which is exactly the kind of work a man needs when the ground has just shifted underneath everything he thought was permanent. Some things you water every day, and they grow into something good. Some things you water every day, and they turn out to have been growing in a direction you never saw. You find out in the end which was which. You always find out in the end. If this story reached you today, I'm glad. Hit that like button, subscribe, and leave me a comment. I read everyone, and I read them the same way I read everything, carefully and with my full attention. That's all for today. I'll see you on the next one.